Today we start our story in England and then go to Scotland. So sit back as we go to the late 19th century. William Berry was born on the 25th of May, 1859, in the beautiful English market town of Stourbridge, which is situated 13 miles from Birmingham in the county of Worcestershire. At the time of William's birth, the town was famed for the manufacture of glass and railroad steam locomotives, and was considered a very important manufacturing hub in Victorian Britain. William was the youngest of 4 children, but just 3 months after his birth, his oldest sister named Elizabeth Ann died at the age of 7 during an epileptic fit. His mother, named Mary Jane, became very depressed following the death of her daughter, and this was compounded when on the 10th of April, 1860, William's father, named Henry, who worked for a local fishmonger, fell under the wheels of his own cart while travelling back from a market at the nearby town of Halesowen, and tragically died of his injuries. Bereft with grief and suffering with depression, just a month later, on the 7th of May 1860, William's mother, Mary Jane, was committed to the Worcester County Pauper Asylum, where it was recorded she was suffering from melancholia. She remained there for 4 years, until her death on the 30th of March 1864, at the age of 33. When William's mother entered the asylum, a family friend took pity on the children and took them in. She sent them to school and tried to give William and his older brother and sister a solid education. William, however, was not a good scholar, and at the age of 16, he found work as a factory clerk in a local warehouse. He left this job in 1880 as he failed to repay a loan and went to Wolverhampton to live with his maternal uncle, where he found work in a company that manufactured locks. He stayed in this employment for nearly 5 years until he was dismissed at the end of 1884 for theft. But William continued to live with his uncle and tried to earn money by going to more rural communities and selling useful household items such as pegs and pencils to people who found it difficult to regularly go into the town to buy things. This type of work, however, was never going to make William rich. So in October 1887, in the hope of improving his circumstances, he moved to London. He arrived in Bow in the East End and soon found a position working as a local sawdust collector for a well-known local gentleman named James Martin. His employer made his money from his premises at 80 Quicket Street in Bow, which was a large establishment and known by locals to be a den of iniquity. When William arrived in London, he slept in the stable, but as winter was approaching and he had proved to be a good worker, James Martin allowed him to move into the house. Mr. Martin employed a local girl to help him with cooking and cleaning. Her name was Ellen Elliott. In November 1887, she was 31 years old, having been born on the 24th of October 1856 in the central London district of Woolworth. She was the daughter of a London publican named George Elliott and had grown up in the Bricklayers Arms public house, where her father was a landlord. She had some education, but had spent most of her life cooking and cleaning at the pub, and also worked in a jute processing factory. Her life had been hard, and she gave birth to an illegitimate daughter in 1883. But when she found herself destitute, she was sent to the workhouse in Poplar. Here she worked during the day as a needlewoman and looked after her baby daughter. But the conditions in the workhouse were very bad. They were prison-like structures with high walls, stopping residents looking out and the outside world looking in. They were cold and damp, and no fires were allowed after 8:30 p.m. People were crammed into the smallest space possible, and beds had to be shared. 2 blankets were provided, but no sheets or pillows. Sickness and death were common occurrences, and when, in December 1885, Ellen's baby daughter died, she was inconsolable, but after a while, she managed to pick herself up and leave the workhouse. She found work at the premises of Mr. Martin and was determined to improve her situation. She was friendly and polite, slim with fair hair and always neatly dressed. In 1886, her financial circumstances changed when she was left a legacy of bank and railway shares from an aunt, which were worth around £300. As William and Ellen were both working for Mr. James Martin, they would regularly chat and somewhat inevitably started courting. William, however, liked to drink and would often be seen late at night at the local pubs and taverns. And when he drank, he became loud and aggressive. William was dismissed from his position as he had many unpaid debts. Nevertheless, he persuaded Ellen that they should set up home at 3 Swanton Road in Bow, and a month later, on Easter Monday, the 2nd of April 1888, they were married at the parish church in Bromley. Ellen had only known William for a few short months, and 5 days after their wedding, their landlady, Mrs. Elizabeth Haynes, witnessed William threatening his new bride with a knife. Mrs. Haynes would not tolerate this type of behaviour, and despite William trying to appeal to her good nature, she instructed them to leave. To the outside world, William and Ellen were now destitute, but Ellen had already spent time in the workhouse and had no intention of going back, so instead she sold some of her shares in the railway company and paid off her husband's debts. William was then re-employed by Mr. Martin, but William continued to drink and often stayed out all night, even disappearing for a couple of days before returning home in a terrible state. Sometimes he would go straight to bed, but on other occasions he would take his frustrations out on his wife. As these episodes became more regular, Ellen shared her concerns with Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin was very worried about her. No one knew where her husband went at night, only that he had been seen wandering the streets of Bow and Whitechapel. Mr. Martin had also seen William conduct himself in what he thought was a very ungentlemanly manner towards Ellen, who would often be seen at work with bruises and scars on her face. Around June 1888, William was accused of stealing money from his employer James Martin and was dismissed from his position. But William did not let this setback halt his ambitions, and Ellen sold more shares so he could purchase a horse and cart and set himself up as a sawdust merchant. He would buy sawdust from the sawmills in the area and then try to sell it to the many pubs in the city. This worked for a while, but all too often he would arrive at the pub, sell some sawdust, and instead of moving on, he would stay and drink in the pub, returning home with no money and in a drunken state. The couple started to move more often, taking up lodgings in different houses in Bow. But as William's rages could be heard by other tenants, he and Ellen were often asked to move on. William was still trying to sell his sawdust during the day, but his strange behaviour continued at night, often going out and returning in the early hours, or not at all. By January 1889, William had decided to leave London, as he had found himself and his wife employment in the Scottish city of Dundee. However, he told his landlord named Mr. Smith that he and Ellen were going to emigrate to Australia and asked him to make him a large and strong trunk suitable for transporting his and Ellen's possessions. Mr. Smith was quite surprised at the size of the trunk he was being asked to make, as he didn't think that the couple had very many possessions, but he made it and handed it to William. Then on the 19th of January 1889, the couple boarded the steamer named Cambria and travelled overnight to Dundee. They arrived in Dundee on the 20th of January and soon found lodgings at 43 Union Street in a small guest house ran by an elderly couple named Mr. and Mrs. Robinson. They stayed a week before leaving, claiming that the room was too expensive, but this was a great relief for Mrs. Robinson, as she was a little afraid of William. He would always walk very silently, and sometimes she would turn around and William would be right behind her. She considered him a strange and peculiar man. William and Ellen then moved into a small basement below a shop in a 4-storey building at 113 Princess Street. This 2-room lodging was in very poor condition. It was dirty, the decoration was old, and the windows were stained. It was also very cold. Ellen was only occasionally seen by neighbours, but William was often out, especially at night, where he would spend his time in the local pubs and taverns. On the 4th of February, William went to the local shop, which was ran by a local lady named Janet Martin, and he asked if she had a length of rope. She obliged and sold William the rope. He spent the rest of the day in the public gallery at the local courthouse, listening to the cases. The following 3 days he returned to the courthouse, and it was noted by the people present that William seemed to be greatly observing the court proceedings. He was also seen at night drinking and making his way back to his basement lodgings, but neighbours had noticed that they had not seen Ellen. In the evening of Sunday the 10th of February 1889, William entered the Bell Street police station and was greeted by the duty officer named James Parr. William then told the officer a bizarre story of how he had been drinking the night before, and when he woke up in the morning, he found his wife's body on the floor with a rope around her neck. The officer asked if he had summoned a doctor, to which William replied that he had not, and instead cut up some of his wife's body and placed her in a trunk that he had bought from London. William added, but his actions were now preying on his mind, and he was afraid that he would be arrested and accused of being Jack the Ripper. Officer Parr informed his supervising officer, named David Lamb, about the strange gentleman, and after searching William's person and finding a small penknife, they placed him in a cell, while Officer Lamb and Detective Constable Peter Campbell made their way to the basement flat at 113 Princess Street. They entered the impoverished dwelling and immediately noticed the squalid conditions of the lodging. In the room was a trunk, and when Officer Lamb lifted the lid, he saw in front of him the body of a young lady who he presumed was Mrs. Ellen Berry. The police immediately called for a doctor, and due to the gravity of the situation, 2 doctors were summoned, named Dr. Templeman and Dr. Stalker, and they proceeded to examine the deceased. It was obvious to both men that Ellen had died from strangulation. Her abdomen had also been cut open, and other wounds to her body seemed to resemble the injuries the reporters claimed were inflicted on some of Jack the Ripper's victims in London. Strangely, William had also placed books and clothing in the trunk. On further examination, they discovered that the victim's left leg was broken and twisted in order to fit it into the trunk. The doctors, however, told the police that the deceased had died about 5 days previously, which contradicted the story that William had told them. Officer Lamb returned to the police station and charged William with the murder of his wife, Ellen Berry. The police searched the property. There was not much to be found. The only items were a chair and a small bed, which was covered with clothes. But of more interest, they found 2 chalk-written messages. One which read, "Jack the Ripper is at the back of the door." The other one on the stairwell wall, leading down to the basement, read, "Jack the Ripper is in the cellar." The press soon got hold of the story, and due to the wounds on the body and the mysterious chalk messages, they reported that Jack the Ripper had been caught. William Berry had lived in Bow, very close to Whitechapel, and as rumour and speculation continued, one newspaper reported that Ellen had been murdered to prevent her from revealing William's true identity of Jack the Ripper. Others wrote of how he had confessed to Officer James Parr as to who he was, and the people who lived in Princess Street were only too happy to share strange stories about William Berry, even though he had only arrived in Dundee a few weeks prior. The police conducted a more extensive search in the property and interviewed the neighbours. One lady named Marjorie Smith told police how William had asked to borrow a meat cleaver from her, but she had refused to lend it to him. And William's friend David Walker said that when he was reading the newspaper, William had asked him if there was any news about Jack the Ripper. Chief Constable Dewar sent a telegram detailing the circumstances of the crime to the London Metropolitan Police, who were investigating the Whitechapel murders. Inspector Frederick Aberline, who was leading the investigation, interviewed people who knew William Berry in London, and sent 2 officers to interview him in Dundee, but concluded he was not the man they were looking for. The trial of William Berry started on the 29th of March, 1889, and he pleaded not guilty. He told the court that he and his wife had been out drinking, and the following morning he awoke to find her dead on the floor, having been strangled with a cord. He said that he had no recollection of whether he had committed the crime or not, and fearing that he would be apprehended as Jack the Ripper, he picked up a large knife and made a cut in her abdomen. He then decided to conceal the body in a trunk. As strange as this story may have seemed to the court, William's solicitor had insisted on a second post-mortem, which was carried out by a very experienced surgeon named Dr. David Lennox, who was assisted by Dr. William Kinnear. He concluded that in his opinion, Ellen Berry had died of her own hand, and that the cuts to her abdomen were made after her death. The police, however, had insisted on a third post-mortem, carried out by Dr. Henry Littlejohn, who concluded that the deceased had been murdered, but he was unable to ascertain if the mutilations had taken place after her death. The prosecution witnesses included Ellen's sister, named Margaret Corney, William's former employer, James Martin, and his landlady, Elizabeth Haynes, as well as his friend from Dundee, named David Walker. Another witness was a neighbour of the accused named David Duncan, who told the court that on the night in question he heard 3 loud screams come from the direction of the basement flat. The defence did not have much to counter the prosecution and relied heavily on the evidence of Dr. Lennox. They did, however, try to discredit the prosecution witnesses. The proceedings lasted for 13 hours, and at 10:05 p.m, the jury of 15 men retired to consider their verdict. They returned after 25 minutes to find the defendant, William Henry Berry, guilty of the murder of his wife Ellen, but recommended mercy for the accused. The judge, Lord Young, asked the jury on what grounds they recommended the prisoner mercy. The jury foreman explained that it was due to the conflicting medical evidence. Lord Young then instructed the jury to retire once more to consider the verdict. They returned 5 minutes later with a unanimous verdict of guilty with no recommendation for mercy. The judge then sentenced the defendant to death. On the 1st of April, William's lawyer petitioned the Secretary of State for Scotland, Lord Lothian, for clemency, arguing that the sentence should be commuted to life imprisonment on the grounds of the conflicting medical evidence and the jury's initial reservations. He also argued that as William's mother had died in an asylum and the way William had acted since the death of his wife, it would be prudent to presume that William was not of sound mind. However, no reprieve was granted. Shortly before his execution, William admitted the killing of his wife, and on April the 22nd, 1889, he wrote a confession which he asked to be withheld until after his death. His execution date was set for the 24th of April, and when the day arrived, over 5,000 people waited outside for the hoisting of the black flag. As he was being led to the scaffold, he turned to the hangman, named James Berry, and said, "I suppose you think you were clever to hang me." And at 8 a.m, William Henry Berry was hanged. According to the hangman, detectives were sent from London to witness the execution, and when they asked him if they thought he had hanged Jack the Ripper, he replied, "I think it is him right enough." And according to the hangman, a detective replied, "We agree with you, as we now know all about his movements in the past, and we are quite satisfied that you have hanged Jack the Ripper. There will be no more Whitechapel crimes." But was William Henry Berry Jack the Ripper? The last Whitechapel victim was Mary Jane Kelly, who died on the 9th of November 1888. So William's move to Scotland did coincide with the end of the Jack the Ripper murders. There was graffiti at the house, which police claimed had been written before William had moved in. William took Ellen's rings, and it is believed that Jack the Ripper took rings from his second victim, Annie Chapman. William also cut Ellen's abdomen, which was the style of the Ripper. Marjorie Smith, who owned the shop above the Berries' Princess Street flats, said that she once asked Ellen and William about the Whitechapel murders, and she recalled how William said nothing, but Ellen replied, "Jack the Ripper is quiet now." William had also created a false promise of employment to convince Ellen to go to Scotland, and this could be because things were getting too risky for him in London. Some say that he disposed of Ellen as she knew who he really was, and he was afraid that she would reveal his true identity. However, others will point to the fact that the actual crime was not really similar to those that happened in Whitechapel, and that the link between Jack the Ripper and William Berry was driven predominantly by the media. Inspector Frederick Aberline, who was leading the investigation in Whitechapel, also found no substantial evidence against William Berry and dismissed him as a suspect. It is often also pointed out that 3 months after William Berry's death, a lady named Alice Mackenzie was killed in Castle Alley, just off Whitechapel High Street, in the early hours of July the 17th, 1889. When she was taken to the mortuary, she was examined by Dr. Thomas Bond, who was of the opinion that the injuries suggested that this was another Ripper killing. The press then reported that Jack the Ripper was back. Whether she was a Jack the Ripper victim is very much disputed to this day, but if she was, it would mean that William Berry could not have been Jack the Ripper. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As per usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and it'd be really good to know if you think that William Berry was indeed Jack the Ripper. And I will see you in the next brief case.